Have you ever been in a moment where you needed to renew your vision for the future, or are you there now? Um, it doesn't matter how old or young we are. By the way, renewing our vision for the future is a process that occurs likely several times throughout our lifetime. I spoke at a breakfast yesterday about calling and purpose, and I made the comment that we work with so many leaders in the later decades of their lives who experience that need for some kind of renewal. And yet sometimes we assume that when we get into our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, I talked to a leader yesterday. I haven't spoken to one in the hundreds yet, but that will happen, I'm sure, at some point, that we have this assumption that we'll have it all figured out. And I'm telling you, afterwards, I think I had more people in their 60s and 70s come up to me and thank me than I did young people. It was kind of interesting. In fact, one guy was 76 years old and he goes, "You were speaking right at me today." And he said, "By the way, my friends call me Gandalf." So I don't even know if Gandalf is here today, but it was so humbling to just have someone say that who's a couple of decades past me in their own experience. And it's a reality we face across our lifetime. And I also don't want to dismiss you away if you are someone younger, because this idea of renewing our calling or understanding what it's about, that renewing that vision for our future, is so important. And I ask you this: what would change if you had a renewed vision for your future? What would change? I'm Dr. Rob McKenna, and welcome to the Wild Conversation, where we make the best thinking in psychology, leadership, and organizational science accessible to leaders who are willing to learn and edit for their sake and for the sake of others. And today we're continuing our series on what executives are really talking about. And this week, the topic is on renewing your vision for the future. And fundamentally, our need to renew our vision for the future is about this. It's about a clarity of direction based on an inspiration that feels like what we want to do, or what we're supposed to do, or even what we might be called to do. Renewing our vision, it's about a clarity of direction based on an inspiration that feels like what we want to do, or feel we're inspired or supposed to do. And it's interesting because a vision, and when I talk to you about this, also keep this in mind, as was said about me, is like, I am a person in process. So I'm going to give you some principles that we've seen working, but these are things that I continue to work out for myself. I hope that you hear that from me. A vision is a forward projection of a future state, often based on pieces of that future already having been accomplished. But the overall vision oftentimes has not. It's something we can see that has not fully come to pass. So we have this line of sight to this thing. And here's a couple of things that I would suggest that have been true of my own experience and the experience of leaders that are out there. I'm going to drop a little bit of research into this as well, but here's a couple of things. Oftentimes, it includes both our intent and our letting go. Both our intent, the things we want, and our letting go of the things we want. Very interesting, right? Like, this is a common experience. It also, it may begin as something about us or for us, but with a little intentional thought, will often move towards something that is more inherently about people we serve. So I think oftentimes these visions start with something that feels like it's about us, but then it moves to others. It also typically involves a specific picture of what could be that is based on something we want. So it's a picture, it's a vision, right? It's this picture we have, and I'm going to get concrete before we're done, but it's based on that. And oftentimes, and usually, involves something that we find deeply meaningful, oftentimes based on our past experiences, as many of you know. And what does this have to do with what executives are really talking about? And that may impact all of us. So in my friends who are in executive roles, business owners, people who are in CEO or some kind of other role like that, this is something that they talk about. That's something that I think what's interesting is so often people assume that they don't have to think about these things. But all of you who are in those roles know, like, I'm thinking about this all the time. Like, this is important. And I have so many stories from my friends. Like, they're very personal stories, but here's just a couple of examples that some of you will think I'm talking about you, and I'm probably not, but you might think I am. One executive said his vision, because these are common. One executive said his vision was as simple as wanting to retire in 2 years. And I've told this story before. And as he continued to open his eyes further, became a statement of wanting a state of what he described as shalom for every person in his business. So it was interesting, right? The vision went from, I want to retire, to within a year, there's something deeper going on here. Another leader who had simply said, my vision is to Forex my business, now has a vision of investing deeply in the development of every leader in his care. And I'm not saying the Forexing the business is a bad thing, but it was just a start. It was just a start. Another leader said her vision moved from inheriting a business from her father that she never intended to run to a vision of leading an organization that would have an impact on how every other business in her industry is run and how people are developed. Like, it's just, and these people have even more complex stories than that, but I could tell you story after story of different visions that they had. Like, and they're thinking, how do I do this? This is what I now see is in front of me. How do I do this? And these visions and their formation were not a simple process for these leaders. And they never are. They require us to consider risks, to take leaps of faith, and even to realize that the vision we thought we saw was going to turn into something else. And what I'll tell you is that whether your vision is as simple as finding a certain kind of job or spending a season in college to build self-awareness and to test some things out. And by the way, last night I was working with one of my sons on his cover letter as he applies for internships. And one of the most affirming moments I could ever receive is at the end of it, he goes, I was just helping him edit his letter. And he goes, hey, Dad, you're pretty good at this. So I was like, oh, yeah, you know what I mean? Like that's you don't get that every day from your kids. So it's kind of awesome. So it's whether it's like trying to get that first internship or as complex as launching or relaunching a business, or as deep as moving into a season of patience. Like, I think this is sometimes the vision is not to do something right now, but it's to wait. Maybe a season of deepening faith and service to others. But there are two things I will tell you that these visions have in common from a research perspective. And the two things are what are described as these are researchy words because you have to explain them, but are salience and elaboration. Salience and elaboration. And salience, I'm going to simplify these things. I could get deep into this, and we may actually do this in a different wild conversation where I break down what the specifics of these things are. Because usually in research, variables like this, they're multifaceted, which these things are. But quite simply, salience is the extent to which something is meaningful to you. It's salient. You could almost taste it. And elaboration is the extent to which is something specific. And meaningfulness and specificity take a little time and work, and often I would describe as documented intent. But, and I'm gonna explain what I mean by that. Written down is what I mean by that, quite simply. For people like me that need a bottom shelf, like McKenna, what do you mean? Write it down. So we'll get to that in a second. But here are some of the realities. We live in a world that tells us that we can do anything we want to do. I've talked about this before. It's not true, by the way. You can try anything you want to try, but it's kind of ridiculous, right? Just watch the auditions for American Idol and you'll know what I mean. Or maybe even more important, is that even right? Or is that even the right way to think about things? But most of us would say no. Our reality is that not all of us can sing, lead well right now, or even be visionaries, because this is my second point about this. What if the vision you realize is that you are an outstanding operational support person to a visionary? One of the ridiculous things I think that's in our world is that everybody's a leader and everybody's a visionary. So imagine, just stop for a moment and imagine that world. Everybody's got their head in the clouds and everybody's in charge. Okay, enough said, right? So I want to just maintain this pause. I don't want to put the burden of vision on everybody. I don't want to do that. I think a vision for your life and where you will serve is important, but But the idea that we all are visionaries is kind of scary to me. And I always tell people, like, if you are an incredible COO, like you've got operational, that is hard to find. Visionaries are a dime a dozen. Like let's lean into that. That might be the vision for your life. But we're often given messages in our world that we are all leaders and that we can do anything and that our job is to dream big. But what if the vision of our lives isn't to dream big, but to both live a life of but to live a life of purpose and calling, and to live a life of intent based on who we are, what we're good at, who we know, what we want. What if it's all about that? So if a vision, let me get back on track. If a vision is a picture, it's a graphic and specific picture that is both meaningful and specific, salience and elaboration. Let's talk about a couple of examples. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from my life, because I have had visions that have come to reality, and I feel blessed. I'm old enough to have had that happen too. I couldn't have said this a few years ago, but let me give you a couple of examples. And I share these in hopes that they might inspire you to think about your own vision for the future and what might be there. And understanding that we each have our own way of seeing is important, because this is a big part of the Wild conversation, is that we know that in everything that Wild Leaders does, we know that there are certain lanes and certain like machines, if you will, in the workout life of a leader that are important, but the way that we actually work that out looks different for each of us. And so I think that's true with visions as well. And so we see things differently, and we go about the process. I am what I describe as a construction deconstruction guy. And what I mean by that is I'm not the person, if you had me look at an empty piece of land, I'm not the person who can look at that piece of land and go, I can see exactly the house that is supposed to be built on it. It's going to be built exactly that way. It's just not me. I have friends who are like that. I'm the person who would, this is why I'd be a horrible land developer. I'm the person who would look at that piece of land, need to build part of the house, realize it's wrong, tear that part down. I'm going to tear the framing off the side I put on there. And it's going to be a process of constructing and deconstructing to build the thing. So it's why when I would write papers with doctoral students, I would tell them that's the way I write. So when they would bring me a draft, they would think it was done. And I'd be like, no, we're just getting started. I couldn't see what the paper was going to become, the research paper, until we actually had part of it constructed. And then but they didn't like that. A lot of times they're like, no, that draft is done. I'm like, hey, it don't work that way with McKenna. So it was kind of a rough process. But so knowing that you may see things differently is important. I've had 3 visions that have become realities, and I'm going to give you some of the things that were important for me. One is that I launched an industrial organizational psychology program. It was a master's and a PhD program from scratch at a university. And to date, that was a program I led and was a part of for 17 years. To date, that program is now closing in on having graduated 500 students. What's crazy about it is that every one of the things I'm about to describe to you started as a document, a written proposal for the future. And I would always laugh, because the original document for that program, it was words on a page that eventually became students who had alumni who, nearing 500 people who had alumni in some of the most powerful corporations in the world. But I always laugh when I'd look back, because I would look back at that document and go like, I had no business doing this, but I wrote it down and it had certain characteristics that helped it move forward. The other thing was Wild Leaders. The fact that I can see your faces right now is such a miracle. Like, it's just unbelievable, because the visioning process, and some of you I've actually let in under the hood of this whole process. I've sent this to a couple of you people. I'm looking at your faces right now. This was written into a document years and years ago with very specific intent. And I called it my Jerry Maguire moment, to say, like, what do I want? But then I had to test that thing. And then the Wild Foundation is another thing that now exists. That's been an incredible way to resource people in need who needed leader development, who couldn't afford it in this season of their lives. And so those 3 things have come to pass. But let me give you some of the beginning characteristics. Number 1 is that it often, in every case for me, it included encouragement from a tough audience, someone that does not encourage me normally. That's what I mean by tough audience. And there's a friend of mine named Paul Yost that I worked with for years. And in every one of these situations, Paul Yost looked at me and said, it's a no-brainer. And when Paul would say it's a no-brainer, I knew it was something that I maybe was called to do. And he does not talk to me that way. So you know what I mean? So it was a tough audience. A written statement, as I said, and a documented purpose. They all started with pieces of paper. A budget. Every one of these things I've done included a budget, resourcing, or a pro forma from a business standpoint. A next step. Every one of these included a next step. When I wrote my first book, which was attached to a larger vision, one of my first priorities was call a guy named Les Parrott, who had become a best-selling author and knew how to publish books. And so the next day I called him. So it included a first next step. And then it included a campaign, what I described making the rounds, asking for permission and asking for help. Like in every case, I had to go on the road. To get that program launched in a university, I had to talk with more people than I wanted to talk to, but I had to go on the road and I had to politic and I had to get buy-in, and all those kinds of things were part of the process, a part of the work. But so those are some of the setup things. And just before we launch out in our conversation, I want to give you some things. If you were to write a document, I'm going to give you a list of things that would be things to think about as you write this document. Okay. So, and we'll provide these things into the chat as well. But here are some things. And by the way, if you're like, you're talking too fast, Rob, all of this is contained in the Wild Toolkit. So I'm giving away part of the store right now, because most of these questions are contained within what's called the Calling and Purpose Inventory. So, because quite frankly, the Wild Toolkit, and some of you have seen this, it's not the only thing it does, but one of the things it does, it's a visioning process. It calls out things, as they would say from the research, regarding salience and elaboration. It calls out things where there's a discrepancy between where you are and where you could be. It just invites you to see those things. So here's that list. It's 10 things. I'm going to roll pretty fast, all right? But they're not complicated. Here's what I would encourage you to write down. If you want to make it come to pass, wrestle through these things. Number one, purpose. Why do you want that? Why do you want what you envision? Why do you want it? Number two, and Claire's putting these things in the chat, so you can save the chat at the end of this too. Strengths. What are you really good at doing? And who has told you that? I also wrote down, what am I not good at doing? So that's a part of my statement as well. And I mean this, if you're like in a visioning process, there's nothing more powerful than brainwriting, getting this stuff down and then talking with someone about it. Number three, we describe it as your unique contribution. What do you bring that is different? In the strategy literature, they talk about creating dependency in markets. And I love this when it comes to visioning for you personally. They talk about this. In order to create something that has what they call it dependency. In other words, you think about a product. What is it that creates dependency on a product? And they say three things: something that's valuable, rare, and difficult to imitate. In what ways are you valuable, rare, and difficult to imitate? Like, what do you have that's part of you? Number four, this was a huge one in my process, especially for wild leaders several years ago. I had an executive coach who said, Rob, write down all of your accomplishments and don't be shy. You need to know what you've accomplished in the past, because it'll tell you a lot about what you can accomplish in the future. So I wrote them all down. And her saying, don't be shy, was important. Number five, a call and an intention. A call and an intention. What I mean by this is a sacrificial desire you can't escape. I would almost say this. This is something that you feel so called to that you would die for it. I know that sounds so extreme, but like, it puts death in a whole new box when you're like, I would die for this. You know what I mean? Like, this is so important to me. Like, I would sacrifice so much for this. Number six, a people to serve. Who do you feel called to serve? Who are you in a unique position to serve? Just writing that down will have power. Number seven, sacrifice. What might you have to sacrifice to get it? So for some of you, it's that paycheck. For some of you, it's I'm going to speak up and I don't speak up. For some of you, it's I'm going to shut up and I don't shut up. For some of you, it's going to be you're going to have a conversation with a spouse or a loved one. I don't know what it is, but there's sacrifice. Number 8, a little more appreciative, a potential. What potential would open up? What potential would open up if you actually could do this? Number 9, resourcing. What do you need to get it started? For me, that was oftentimes a budget. It was also I needed support. I needed help. And so I went and I got support. I got funding and I got help. And then number 10 is this. This is a big one, editing. I call editing. It's testing and reframing and openness to being off. Maybe it's not your vision is even a possibility, but supporting or jumping into someone else's vision or team. I think that could be at the end of it all. It's like, maybe it's that, remaining open to that. And as you consider the renewal of your vision or the building of one, I hope this helps. It's a lot to chew on, but here's where we crowdsource. We're going to get out into these conversations. Let's keep this conversation going. And if something I said is affirming or provoking, tear it up, build it back up, and go where it's important for you to go. So let's keep the conversation going.